Okay, well, it's good to be back with you this morning, and I want to talk about how science confirms biblical creation because as we proclaim the gospel, there are objections to that, right? People say, no, you can't trust the Bible because, and probably the number one answer is, well, science has disproved the Bible, especially in Genesis. That's where people say, maybe later on, the Exodus, that might have happened, maybe, but there's no way God created in 6 days, and because we know evolution, millions of years of evolution is the way that life came about. And so I find it very helpful to know a bit about the basics of science, just so you can talk intelligently on this subject. And I don't use these lines of evidence as a proof of creation, because we saw, if you were able to come last night, we saw that there is an ultimate proof of creation, and the fact that science is even possible is a proof of creation. But nonetheless, I think science is confirmatory. It confirms biblical creation. It's what we'd expect. If the Bible's true, we would expect science to be the way that it is. And in my career, I've had the opportunity to work with some brilliant people, truly brilliant people. And I've met a lot of very brilliant creationists. I've met the inventor of the MRI, who's a creationist, by the way, and a brilliant guy. I've met all kinds of brilliant scholars. I know a PhD from Harvard who's a brilliant creationist. He's a friend of mine. And I've met brilliant people who are on the side of evolution. In my career at the University of Colorado, when I was getting my PhD there, most of the people there were evolutionists, and they believed in the Big Bang and the billions of years, and yet they're highly intelligent. There's a tendency sometimes for us to think, well, if you don't believe the way that I do, then, well, you're just not that bright. But the fact is, there are bright people on both sides of this issue. And we saw last night the reason why that is. It's because we have a different way of looking at the world. And when I look at the world, I see it through biblical lens, and I think that that's the right way to look at it. We saw last night that biblical presuppositions are the only presuppositions that'll make knowledge possible. If you want to trade those in for something else, you're reduced to foolishness. Nonetheless, many people look at the world through the lens of secular thinking, and when you do that, you're thinking in terms of natural processes generating everything. Uniformitarianism, the idea that rates and conditions are basically the same now as they always have been, and therefore slow, gradual processes produced Earth's features. And when you look at the evidence, then you're going to tend to draw interpretations that are consistent with that belief system that you bring to the evidence. Whereas I look at the evidence through the lens of Scripture, biblical history. What we summarize, we call them the 7 C's of history, 7 words that start with C, that just kind of summarize biblical history. Creation, God created a perfect world, a world that he himself called very good. And God has high standards. If our righteousness is like filthy rags, when God looks at the world and it's very good, you can believe it's very good. It's not going to be full of the death and suffering that we have today. That was introduced at step 2 there, corruption, because God gave Adam dominion over the world. And so when Adam sinned, it affected the world, because that's the nature of authority. That's how it works. Catastrophe, the wickedness of mankind became great, and God judged the world because he's a righteous judge, and he won't tolerate sin indefinitely. He's merciful. He's willing to pay for our sin. That's awesome. But nonetheless, for those who are unrepentant, God will judge them, and he did that with water. He's going to do it again by fire. Confusion, the confusion of tongues at the Tower of Babel, where God split up the people groups into the different basic language units that we have today. Of course, languages have diversified some since. That's just natural. And then we have Christ. God himself steps into history, becomes a man, and then takes our place on the cross. That's awesome, so that we can be saved. And then the 7th C has yet to happen, at least in its fullness. The consummation, where paradise lost will be paradise restored. And we can be a part of that new earth, that new paradise, but only if our sins are forgiven. Otherwise, we'd ruin it the same way we ruined the original. And so it makes sense. And when I look at the world, I'm thinking in terms of that history, and it is recorded history, by the way. A lot of people think somehow that it's logical to just reject recorded history and then rely instead on guesswork. That's what evolutionists are doing. They're rejecting recorded history and relying on guesswork instead. And I don't find that to be particularly logical. In any case, when we look at the universe through the lens of Scripture, we're going to find that it makes sense. And I want to hit 3 areas of science where it's helpful to know just the basics. And those 3 areas would be genetics, which is the study of how traits are passed on from one organism to the next. Information theory, the idea of how information is transmitted and its source and so on. And then finally, geology, the study of rocks, and also paleontology, the fossils that we find within those rock layers. And so let's begin by jumping in to heredity, the study of how animals change over time, or how they inherit traits from their parents and so on. Do animals change over time? Let's think about dogs, for example. Do dogs change? Do dogs change? Yeah, they change. What do they change into? Dogs. Yeah, dogs change into dogs. That's right. And that's not evolution. That's just dogs, right? And we'd expect that because the Bible tells us in Genesis 1 many times that God created animals after their kinds, or after its kind, and plants as well, after their kind, after its kind. A phrase that's used 10 times in Genesis 1, we better take it seriously. And kind would appear to be the reproductive limit of an organism. We know that because when God brought the animals to the ark, he brought 2 of each kind to preserve life. So that must be the reproductive limit of organisms. And so, by the way, kind is not the same as species. That's important because you can get different species. There is a process called speciation where you can get multiple species from a common ancestor. That happens. But they're still the same kind. A group of mosquitoes goes off and lives in a cave for 100 years, and when it's brought back out, it can't interbreed with other mosquitoes, and so it's classified as a new species. But they're still mosquitoes. What were they? Mosquitoes. What are they now? Mosquitoes. What will they always be? Mosquitoes. Yeah, that's not evolution, that's just mosquitoes. Yeah. And it's the same with dogs, and it's the same with all organisms. You can get different species, but they always remain the same kind. And God has built in that ability to diversify into organisms. You see, I find a lot of times evolutionists will misrepresent what it is that creationists teach. And they'll say, well, creationists believe that God created all the species on the earth as they are today. And in some versions, even in the locations that they are today. That is not biblical, folks. That is not what we believe. Animals do change. I don't believe that animals have always been exactly as they are today. I don't believe that there were poodles in the Garden of Eden, right? Because it was a paradise. It was very good. You're not going to have poodles in there. So, not at all. This is what we actually believe, okay? Yes, there are kinds, and yes, they diversify and they split, and the poodles are just one of those little offshoots that we see up there, ultimately as a result of sin, as we'll see. But in any case, they remain the same kinds, right? So dogs have always been dogs, always will be dogs. You can get lots of different breeds. That's no problem. There's some breeds I really like. I love golden retrievers. I think that's just a sweet breed. They're pretty and they're just nice. And God built that into the original dog kind, the capacity to get all those different breeds later on. Some kinds have gone extinct. Dinosaurs aren't around anymore. There are some kinds where certain varieties have gone extinct and other varieties remain, like elephants. Mammoths, we believe, are part of the elephant kind. They're genuinely related to each other. It's just that particular variety has gone extinct, the mammoths, and yet there are various kinds of elephants. There's the Indian elephant and the African elephant, for example, that remain. And so this is what we actually believe, okay? Animals do change within their kinds. And yes, you can get speciation within a kind. On the other hand, in the evolutionary view, there really are no kinds because the diversification of animals and plants is unlimited. And so in the evolutionary view, all organisms are related. They're all descended from a common ancestor, which would be something like a bacterium, something like that. And so in that view, you are related to broccoli. Yeah, that's your distant cousin. And I mentioned that one time. I was actually speaking to a group of atheists. By divine providence, I got to speak to them, which is kind of neat. And I pointed out, I said, in your worldview, you believe that broccoli is your distant cousin. And afterwards, one of them came up to me and said, weren't you kind of making fun of us for saying that we believe we're related to broccoli? And I said, but isn't that what you believe? He said, well, yeah. I said, well, there you go then, right? I mean, don't shoot the messenger. If that belief sounds silly, you ought to reconsider your belief. Don't pick on me for pointing it out. Anyway, I don't believe we're related to broccoli. I do believe we're related to each other. We're all descended from Adam and Eve. Now, to see which of these views is consistent with science, we need to know something about DNA. This is a very long molecule that occurs in the cells of your body. This in itself, it's just amazing, the fact that we look at the same evidence and draw very different conclusions. DNA, this very complex molecule, and it has these little, what are called nucleotide base pairs that form the rungs of the ladder. And there's 4 different kinds, and they're abbreviated by the 4 letters C, G, A, and T. A's and T's always pair up, G's and C's always pair up, but the order could be anything. And those orders spell out the instructions to produce the proteins that make you. It's kind of astonishing. And you've got 6 billion of these letter sequences in your DNA. Amazing. 3 billion, you have 2 sets of DNA and 3 billion on each set. And I mean, I think that's astonishing. We think we're clever, we can get all this information on a DVD, right? And that's pretty neat. But God put the information to make you on a molecule. That's awesome. And again, it goes to show you how our presuppositions affect the interpretation of evidence, because the discoverers of DNA, Watson and Crick, were atheists. And they looked at it and said, we've disproved God. I'm thinking, how could there be any more powerful confirmation of God than the fact that the instructions to make you are encoded on a molecule? That's awesome. It's kind of like you can spell help in with beads on a rope in Morse code, right? Just by the way they're arranged. Likewise, the letters in DNA have the information to make you. And that's the same with all life on Earth. It's all DNA based if it's actual life, even plants. And so the reason a cabbage comes out as a cabbage is it's got the instructions to make a cabbage. And you've got the instructions to make a person. And aren't you glad you got the long end of the stick on that one? So, and by the way, some of the instructions are the same. And evolutionists will say, see, there you go. We must have a common ancestor because some of our instructions are the same. Well, think about this. The reason some of those instructions code for proteins, right? And we need some of the proteins from things like cabbage and other organisms for that matter. You see, God could have created unique proteins and therefore unique DNA for all organisms on Earth, but then we wouldn't be able to gain any nutrients from those other organisms. The only thing we'd be able to eat is each other. And so that would be a problem, right? So it's very important that some of our instructions are the same. It amazes me that sometimes the way that evolutionists reason in terms of these things. But yeah, we do have DNA in common with a banana, and that's why you can eat a banana and gain nutrients from it, because it has some of the same proteins you have. You have 2 sets of DNA. You get 1 set from dad, you get 1 set from mom. They have 2 sets of DNA. They got it from their parents and so on, all the way back to Adam and Eve. And the interesting thing is when a couple has children, the children will get 1 of the 2 genes from each set. And you don't know in advance which one they're going to get. And so the child might get that gene from dad and that gene from mom. And then and so they get, and then so on. You don't know. It appears to be random. And so one child might look like that, and another child will get a different set, a different combination of DNA. They're still getting the instructions from their parents, but they're getting a unique combination. And so you have a totally unique combination of DNA, unless you have an identical twin, okay? And that's why, siblings, they look a little similar, but sometimes they have some differences as well, differences in eye color and hair color and so on, because they've gotten a different combination from their parents. And this is an ingenious system because, you say, well, 6 billion instructions, that's pretty good. But when you consider the number of possible combinations, it's enormous. You take a couple like that, in terms of the number of unique children they could produce, mathematically, it's greater than the number of atoms in the universe by an enormous amount. So it's just amazing. God came up with this way of producing diversity within human beings that is absolutely ingenious. Now, here it is with blood type. So if you have the combination capital A, capital letters in this instance represent dominant genes. Your blood type's A. A and O also gives you blood type A because A is dominant, O is recessive. Maybe you remember doing this in school. So those are the combinations that'll give A blood type. If you have B blood type, it's one of those combinations in the middle, either B or B and O. And then if you have AB blood type, you have 1 of each, and they're codominant, so they both express. The only way you can have blood type O is to have both O alleles, both O genes, because they're recessive. And so there's the 4 possible blood types for human beings. And the thing I find interesting is that if mom has blood type A, and it's what we call the heterozygous combination, where you have an O and an A, and dad has heterozygous B, where you have the O and the B, the children could have any possible blood type. Because they could get the A allele from mom, they could get the O allele from dad, and their blood type would be A. They could get the B from dad, the O from mom, and blood type B. They could get the A from mom, the B from dad, and have blood type AB. Or they could get the O from mom and the O from dad and have blood type O. Interesting. So one child might have a blood type like mom. One child might have a blood type like dad. And the other 2 children would have blood type that neither parent has. Now, it's not that they somehow miraculously evolved new information. They still got the information from their parents. They just have a unique combination. So you probably have some traits that are like your parents, whether it's eye color or hair color, whatever, and you probably have some traits that your parents don't have, but you still got the information from them. It's just because you have a unique combination, you have some unique traits. It's a very ingenious system. Here it is with the skin color. We basically all have the same skin color, brown. It's just a question of how much brown. There's a pigment called melanin. There's a couple different forms of it, but one of the forms is basically a sort of a gray pigment. And if you have these genes up in the upper left, capital A, capital B, then your body will produce a lot of melanin, and it'll spread it out over the skin, and so you have very dark complected skin. If you have the lowercase a, like in the lower right box, then you have very light colored skin. Now, if somebody down in this box, down here on the lower right, if they get married to somebody in that box, their kids are going to be in that box, right? Because the only letters are lowercase. That's the only possibility. And likewise, if somebody in the upper left box gets married to somebody in the upper left box, their kids are going to be in that box. But if you're off axis, if you're on the diagonal there, where you have, let's say, the upper right, where you have capital A, capital B, lowercase b, and they get married to somebody in that box, their kids could be any shade, couldn't they? Because they have all the letters available. And so we think probably Adam and Eve had a middle brown skin color, probably the combination in the upper right there. There's other ways to do it, but that's one way that that could happen. And so, they wouldn't both be very light complected, because then you'd never have the darker colors. And so this accounts for how we have the different variations that we see in human beings today. We're going to kind of focus in on dogs, because dogs have lots of variation within their genome, within their DNA, and dogs reproduce quickly, and so we can see how they vary over time. And so this is how we account for the different breeds and so on of dogs that we have today. It's just the information that God planted in the original kind, and then how that outworked over time. Now, here's the thing, though. If evolution's true, then you have something like bacteria eventually evolving into, say, a horse, as well as everything else on Earth, okay? Now, bacteria have some information in their DNA. They have the information to make bacteria. A horse has a lot more information in its DNA. It's not just that it has more DNA, which it does, but it has more information in its DNA. It's got more instructions. It's got instructions to make eyes and ears and bones and so on. Bacteria lack those instructions, and therefore they can't make those things. So it seems to me rather obvious that if evolution is true, then information has to increase, doesn't it? At some point, the instructions to make eyes and bones and so on had to be added to the instructions for the bacteria, if in fact horses evolved from something like bacteria, okay? And so evolution requires, at the very least, an increase in the genetic information. Now that's important because the processes that we observe in nature actually decrease the information in the genome. They're the opposite of evolution, and I'm going to explore some of those. And I'm not saying this is the only problem for evolution, but I'm pointing out that unless you can add new information, brand new information to the genome of these organisms, you don't have evolution. You can't do it. You're just going to get variation within a kind. And that's very interesting, because processes that evolutionists like to believe are responsible for evolution actually decrease information. And one of those processes is natural selection. You've heard of natural selection. A lot of people mistake that for evolution. They think they're the same. They're actually opposite. Natural selection is true. And it was written about by a creationist, Edward Blythe, long before Darwin. Darwin just thought that that was the mechanism of evolution, but it can't be, because while evolution requires an increase in information, natural selection only reduces the information in the genome. Let me show you how this works. Suppose you have two dogs, and suppose they have a gene for short fur and a gene for long fur, and suppose those genes have a combined effect, which some genes do, such that these dogs have medium length fur. Okay, now this is simplified, but the basic genetic principles here are true. And suppose those dogs fall in love and they have offspring. Some of the pups are going to get the short gene from mom, the short gene from dad, and they're going to have short fur. That'll happen. Some of the dogs are going to get the short gene from one parent, the long gene from the other. In fact, statistically, 50% of the offspring would have that combination, right? So they're going to have medium length fur just like their parents. And then some dogs are going to get the long gene from mom and the long gene from dad, and they're going to have very long fur. And so that happens. Now, this is a great example of variation within a kind, because we started out with dogs that just had medium length fur, and we ended up with different varieties. That's great. Do we have any new information at this point? Well, we started with information for short and long and by combination medium, and we ended up with information for short, long, and by combination medium. There's been no gain in information. There's no evolution at this point. We started with dogs. We ended up with dogs. It's not evolution. It's just dogs. Okay? Well, let's explore natural selection then. So let's suppose the environment gets very cold. And so now what's going to happen? Well, the dogs that have the shorter and medium length fur, they don't do so well in a cold climate, right? They would not like Nebraska very well. And so sadly, they die. Yeah. Now, the dogs that survive are the ones that have the longer fur because they're able to survive in that colder climate. They're well adjusted to it. And so when they meet other dogs that have survived, those will also be the long-furred dogs. And when they reproduce, what combination will the pups have? They'll have the long combination, right? And so the short-haired and the medium-haired have been eliminated from the environment because of the environmental conditions there. You see, they're not well adapted to that environment. This is a great example of adaptation. This kind of thing occurs in the world. And if an animal is not well suited to its environment, it tends to die in that environment. And so now, is this evolution, though? Have we gained any new information? Well, no, we haven't gained any. In fact, we've lost information, haven't we? Because we started out with information for short and long, and we ended up with just information for long. Natural selection is the opposite of evolution, because evolution is about increasing information. Natural selection reduces information by killing off the organisms that have information for traits that are not suitable to that environment. If the environment gets hot now, are the dogs going to ever go back to short or medium-length fur? The answer is no, they're just going to die. Unless some have survived or migrated in from another part of the world, they're just going to die because that information is now gone. Now, if we started the experiment over again and you had all three varieties, and this time, let's say the environment gets very hot. So now what's going to happen? Well, now the dogs that have the longer fur, they don't do so well in that hot environment. They die from heat stroke, right? And so the dogs that survive are now the ones that have the shorter fur. They're now well suited to that environment, and so they go find other dogs that have survived because they have shorter fur, and they reproduce, and they reproduce dogs with short fur. This is a great example of adaptation. This kind of thing happens. This is not the only kind of adaptation, but it's one kind of adaptation in which a group of organisms, they shift their gene frequency to match the environment that they're in, because if they didn't, they die, you see. And so this is a great example of adaptation, great example of natural selection or survival of the fittest, but it's not evolution at all, because we started with dogs and ended up with dogs. That's not evolution, that's just dogs. And we didn't gain any information. On the contrary, we lost information. We started with information for long and short, and by combination medium, we ended up with just short. Natural selection can only remove information from the genome. That's it. That's all it does. And we find, lo and behold, that dogs that ended up in the colder environments tend to have the longer genes. Those that ended up in the hot environments tend to have the genes for shorter fur, and so on and so forth. So dogs do match their environment. We'd expect this. As the dogs were on Noah's Ark, and by the way, you'd only need 2 dogs on board Noah's Ark, right? You don't need 2 dingoes and 2 Dalmatians and 2 border collies. You certainly don't need 2 poodles, right? You just need 2 dogs. And you can get all those different breeds later. Well, by the way, the dogs we think that were on the Ark would have been more like the wolf variety, because wolves still have a lot of the heterozygous combination, big A, big B, little b. So 2 dogs on board Noah's Ark, that's all you'd need. They come off, they reproduce, they split off, they travel away from the mountains of Ararat, and they carry certain genes with them. And if the genes are suitable to that environment, they'll survive there, and if they're not, they die. And some genes are kind of neutral, like eye color doesn't really have a strong effect on survival. It's just where they happen to end up. So we do find that dogs that are in the hotter environments have thinner, shorter fur. Those that are in the cold environments, thicker, longer fur. That's exactly what we'd expect. Great example of adaptation, great example of natural selection. Very poor example of evolution, because there's been no new information. No new information. This is how we account for the different varieties of wild dogs that we find in the world today. It's just that the genetic information that God programmed into the dog kind and natural selection, eliminating those traits that are not suitable to their environment. Well, what about mutations, though? Because people will say, but Dr. Lisle, evolution is not just natural selection, it's natural selection and mutation. So we got to talk about mutations. Mutation is basically a mistake in your DNA. Often when DNA is being copied, sometimes there's a copying error. And occasionally those get through. By the way, there is an editor system in your cells that can correct most mutations, interestingly. Did you know that? You have a spell checker in your DNA. And it'll correct 999 out of 1,000 mutations. Isn't that fascinating? But every now and then one gets through. We're no longer in a perfect world. And so mutations occur. Copying mistakes occur. And when that happens, it results usually in a trait that is different because those genes have been damaged. So you have dogs that have information for 4 legs, 4 normal legs. And all dogs should have that information. But there's been a copying mistake. And so some of that information is scrambled. It's missing. And so the legs don't form properly, and you end up with a dog with short, stubby little legs. That happens. That's one of the mutations that happens, or a combination of mutations that happens in dogs. And if you think about it, a dog like that little guy on the right there would not do so well in the wild, would he? Because he can't run very fast on those poor little legs, and he can't catch anything. He's more likely to be picked off by something himself. So dogs like that do not do well in the wild. Natural selection, to some extent, will weed out mutations. Because, in fact, some mutations are fatal, and they're immediately eliminated by natural selection. But some are just inconvenient, and so they just make it a little harder for that animal to survive, less likely for it to survive. So in the wild, mutations are kept somewhat in check. Not completely, but in the domestic world, some people like dogs that have short, stubby little legs because they can't jump up on you as much. And so people will take these little guys and they'll breed them with other dogs with short, stubby little legs, and you end up with lots of dogs with short, stubby little legs. And they don't have to survive in the wild because they have a human caretaker who will feed them and take care of them and spend millions of dollars trying to keep them alive. Okay, so my point is domestic breeds of dogs tend to be full of mutations. They really do. There's all kinds of mutations in various domestic breeds. There's a mutation that causes a dog's snout not to form properly. A dog is supposed to have a long snout. It helps with their ability to smell because the way the sense works. But there's a mutation that causes the dog's snout to be short. But the skin was designed to fit the longer snout, so it hangs off the side. And if you don't clean it, it can get infected. And some people think that's cute. You ever think about it from the dog's point of view? Gee, I love having my nose stuffed into my face. That's great. Maybe not so much. Domestic breeds, they've got problems because of these mutations. Poodles, for example, they've got lots of problems because of the mutations that have accumulated in their genome. And by the way, I'm not anti-poodle. They are cute, but they do have some problems. And some of these are directly as a result of a mutation. Others are as a secondary result. One of the mutations that poodles have, dogs have a gene that regulates their fur growth. Their fur is supposed to grow so long, and then it falls out, and that controls the growth. With a poodle, that gene's been damaged, and so their hair grows forever. And that's why you have to give a haircut to your poodle every now and then. Otherwise, you'd end up with a big poof ball. And there's no way that would survive in the wild. Can you imagine that? A poodle in the wild, it's just hair everywhere. It's trying to drag all that hair behind it. It's not going to work. But you need to give them a shave every now and then. Otherwise, the hair can get in their eyes, and they can get infected, and they can go blind, or it can get in their ears, and they can get infected, and so on. It can kill them under certain circumstances. So you have to take special care of this creature because it's suffering some mistakes in its genome. Some of its traits have not formed properly, and you do have to spend a lot of money keeping these little things alive. But is this evolution, though? Have we gained any new information? On the contrary, mutations are a loss of information. That's why they have problems. They're missing some instructions. This is not evolution. It's the opposite of evolution. We've lost some information, and that's why the poor animal has some problems. And all domestic breeds have issues. They do, because they've got these mutations that we've protected. So this is how we account for the different breeds of domestic dogs. It's just the information God put in the genome and mutations, errors that have crept in over time that have resulted in some of these animals having some problems. And so this is not evolution. It's in the opposite direction of evolution. You start out with the wolf kind. We think the animals that came off Noah's Ark would have been similar to wolves because wolves still have a lot of the heterozygous genome. But then what you do when you inbreed dogs, that's what you're doing. You're concentrating those mutations until you get down to the poodle, and then that's kind of the bottom of that's kind of the end of the line there, really. A friend of mine says that you can compare this to cars, and the wolves are kind of like the Rolls Royce of the cars. They got all kinds of extra features that are just kind of nice. Windshield wipers on the headlights. Oh, that's neat. You don't really need that, but it's neat. It's a neat feature. You could remove that, and the car would work just fine. Whereas a poodle is kind of like a Kia. It's you remove one part from a Kia, it doesn't work anymore, right? That's it. That's the bottom of the line. So. This isn't evolution, it's in the opposite direction. That's the thing I want to get across to you today, is that evolution requires an increase in information. Natural selection and mutations decrease information. So you can think about it like, when I do this for kids, I say it's kind of like jelly beans. You can think of the wild kinds of dogs, lots of jelly beans, lots of information in their DNA, until you get down to the poodle, and then you just don't have a lot of information left. It's kind of the minimum amount of information you can have to have a dog still be alive. But could you turn a dog into a cat by removing jelly beans? And the answer is no, because a cat has different information, right? It's got Jolly Ranchers. It's got different instructions in its genome, okay? And so you can't turn one kind of animal into another simply by removing information. And that's all mutations and natural selection do, is they remove information. They degrade organisms over time. So when we take a look at dogs, as one example, and we see how dogs reproduce, we find dogs reproduce dogs. How about that? Now, this is good observational science, isn't it? Testable, repeatable in the present, and it confirms exactly what the Bible teaches, that God made organisms after their kinds. And for that matter, what you sow is what you reap. Corn begets corn. You plant corn, you'll get corn. You won't get strawberries. And it really contradicts what you'd expect if evolution were true, where one kind eventually changes into another. Now, I do have to add that mutations can be beneficial by losing information. See, a lot of times evolutionists will say, well, the reason we know mutations are the mechanism of evolution is occasionally they actually help an organism survive in a particular environment. And that is true. And I'm going to just give you one example, antibiotic resistance. Because people will say, well, this is evolution in action right here, bacteria becoming resistant to penicillin or other antibiotics. Well, let me show you how this works. There's actually a few different ways this happens, but none of them are evolution. So there's a bacterium called H. pylori, there he is, and H. pylori causes stomach ulcers, and that's unpleasant. And so what you do is you go to your doctor, and he gives you an antibiotic. Now, the antibiotic is harmless to you, but it goes in and the bacteria absorbs it. And he's got an enzyme that's just part of his chemistry, part of his internal workings, that when it interacts with that antibiotic, it converts it into a poison, and the poison kills the bacterium, and you feel better until you get your medical bill. There is a mutated form of H. pylori that is missing the instructions to produce that enzyme. Now, he's got just a little bit of that enzyme, but he can't produce very much. And so when the antibiotic goes into him, it just sits there. And he survives, but he survives because he's got less information. Isn't that interesting? It's because he lacks the ability to produce that enzyme that's part of his system, or should be part of his system, that would interact with the antibiotic. He survives, but it's because of a loss of information. It's just occasionally that's helpful. And so what happens is then you kill off the ordinary bacteria, and the only ones that survive are resistant. And so now you have a strain of bacteria that's resistant to antibiotics. And they call them, they call this a superbug because it's got this resistance to it. But it's actually, it's because it's missing some instructions. And in nature, they don't compete well with the healthy H. pylori, because that enzyme they can live without it or without much of it, but it is part of their system. It helps them survive normally. It's just that in the environment of your stomach, when you're taking antibiotics, it's actually an advantage to be missing that enzyme, because it would interact with the antibiotic and kill the bacterium. So yes, mutations can be helpful, but they still lose information, and therefore they're in the opposite direction of evolution. Dr. Lee Spetner, who is a PhD biophysicist who's been studying mutations for decades, he says all point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information, not to increase it. Now, there are different types of mutations, and I've kind of simplified this. There are some mutations where a section of DNA will get duplicated. That happens. And they say, see, there's new information, right? Well, you can think of it like a paragraph in a newspaper that accidentally got duplicated. Do you really have any new information? Could you learn anything from the duplicated paragraph you couldn't learn from the original? Not at all. Just because DNA is made longer doesn't mean it has any new instructions. It's just, it now has redundant instructions. It doesn't have any new information. And in fact, Dr. Spetner says not even one mutation has been observed that adds little information to the genome. I think that's fascinating because according to the evolutionists, we're supposed to be made of these information-increasing mutations, and yet not one has been observed. So you see, science, when we observe DNA and we look at the information in it, we find it's consistent with creation. God having created the original information in the genome, and we've lost some since then. We haven't gained any new information, as the evolutionists would predict. Well, we've been talking about information. There's a whole branch of science that deals with information and how it's transmitted and how it originates and so on. And we sort of have an intuitive feel about information, but how do we define it? Well, a good scientific definition is something that Dr. Werner Gitt has worked on, and basically information always entails these three things. First of all, it always entails a symbolic code system. And so if I pick up a book, it doesn't have to be the Bible, it could be any book, and I pick it up and I turn to a certain page here and I see the word David, okay? Because I'm in 2 Samuel, so David. Now, I'm not seeing David here, am I? I'm seeing a word, David, which represents an idea. It represents a man in this case. So that's a symbolic code system. Check. The Bible counts as information, at least in that first step. But it requires more than that. It also requires language. Well, this Bible certainly has a language. This Bible's English. The Bible's originally written in Hebrew and Greek, some Aramaic. But yeah, there's a language convention there. There's syntax, there's grammar, there's rules about how the letters are to be put together and how words are to be put together and so on. So that works, that matches. And there's meaning. I could learn something when I read this text. There's an expected action on the part of the recipient of the information, that I will do something. There's a purpose for it. In this case, the purpose is that I might have eternal life. The action is that I should repent of my sins. That's the reason God wrote the Bible. That's the meaning that I take away from it, you see. If it's a cookbook, well, a cookbook would count as information, right? Because it's got a symbolic code system. It lists, it's got symbols that represent ingredients, right, by their names. There's a language convention. And there's meaning. There's an expected action. The expected action is that you will combine the ingredients in the way the book says, and the purpose is so that you won't go hungry. So a cookbook counts as information as well. And so let's test our information detection skills. So you got those three criteria: symbolic code system, language, it means something. So could this be information? Could be. It looks like we might have a code system there, right? Could be. Language, well, there could be a language. It looks like it's organized, kind of like in hieroglyphics. Is there meaning? Well, the only way to know that is to translate it. And I happen to know the translation of this. It turns out this is Genesis 1 through 5 in the form of icons. So in the beginning, you see the clipboard, like at the start of a movie. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and God saw the light, that it was good. See that? So it's Genesis 1 in the form of icons. Is this information? Yes. There's a code system, there's a language convention, and then there's meaning. It's telling us how the world came into existence. So this does fit the criteria of information. Now, it turns out whenever you identify something as having information, there are laws of nature that will apply to it. Just like when you have energy, there are laws of nature regarding energy, like the law that says you can't create or destroy energy. You can only transform it. That's the first law of thermodynamics. Likewise, there are laws of information theory. And one of these laws is that information never spontaneously generates in matter. Dr. Werner Gitt, one of the world's experts on information theory, says there is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. So if you just have a box of letters and you jumble it up like that and just shake it or whatever and you open it up, you're not going to have, it's not going to generate new information. It's not going to happen. It doesn't just spontaneously generate in matter. So where does information come from then? Oh, it can be copied, right? A Xerox machine can copy information, and a Xerox machine it's not intelligent, it's just a machine. But Dr. Werner Gitt says that information always originates in a mind. He says, when its progress along the chain of transmission events is traced backwards, every piece of information leads to a mental source, the mind of the sender. And so you can bet If you pick up a book and it has information in it, creative information, it's telling you how to bake a cake, or it's giving you instructions on something, or it's telling you about World War II, if it has creative information in it, you can bet that it originally came from a mind. Now, the particular copy of the book that you have wasn't necessarily produced by a mind. It might have been made by a machine that makes lots of books at the same time, right? But where did that machine get its information from? A computer, probably. Where did that computer get its information from? Another computer. But ultimately, somebody wrote it, if it's got brand new creative information in it. Machines can't generate information. They can copy information. They can't create information because they're not intelligent. They don't have a mind. And that's intuitive, isn't it? I mean, if you found a book, your first inclination would not be to say, well, this probably came about by an explosion in a typewriter. You would think, well, somebody wrote this book. Maybe not this copy. It might have been made by an unintelligent machine that makes lots of copies, but somebody originally created that information. Information comes from a mind. That's intuitive. It is a law of nature. And the interesting thing is, when we apply this to genetics, we find that what do we have in DNA? We have information. Interesting. Where did it come from? Well, you got the information in your DNA from your parents. They got it from their parents. They got it from their parents, all the way back to Adam and Eve, who got it from God. So yes, the information in DNA of all organisms on Earth had to originate in a mind. And that eliminates the possibility of evolution, doesn't it? Because if information never generates spontaneously in matter, that means the information in DNA did not spontaneously generate in matter, which is exactly what evolutionists believe. By the way, in their heart of hearts, evolutionists know that information does not come about by chance. They do know that. They're just inconsistent. And I know this because I posted an article years ago on my blog, and it was called On the Origin of Articles. It's kind of a satire, and the article tries to convince you that articles do not have authors, that articles, in fact, are just a random process that happens over time. That a letter is somehow generated, and then eventually another letter, and then a word, and finally a sentence. And most of them are nonsense, but we throw those ones out. Occasionally, a correct sentence will be produced, and we say, well, that's great. And so we pass that on, you see. And then gradually articles become longer and better. And granted, lots of mistakes creep in, but we throw those ones out. So the mistakes that make the article better are the ones that are preserved. And that's how articles come about. Nobody writes them. They're produced by a slow, gradual evolutionary process, probably over millions of years. Okay? Yeah, it's a fun little article. You should check it out when you get the time. It's on not only my blog, but also on the Biblical Science Institute website. The funny thing was not so much the article. The funny thing was the responses that I got to it. Because I allowed evolutionists to comment on that article. And they wrote in, well, we know you wrote this, Dr. Lisle. I said, how? Did you see me write it? Oh, you're just taking it on faith, huh? That's interesting. Okay. Well, we could trace the IP address and prove that you posted. Well, I admit to posting it. When this thing evolved on my computer, it was just too good not to post. I had to share it with you. And but we know. How do you know? You mean you're willing to tell me that you believe in authors? You're one of those authorists that believes that articles have authors? That's just silly. I mean, that's not scientific at all. In fact, if there's an author to this article, let him show himself to me right now in the article, and then I'll believe. And which was funny because I wrote it, So I'm challenging myself to appear, and it's kind of funny. And I said, if you want to believe in authors, that's fine, but keep it in church, man. And the interesting thing was they could have easily refuted me. They could have said, well, you or somebody wrote this because it has information in it. That's all they'd had to have said. Not one of them took that avenue. You know why? Because it would immediately eliminate evolution. They didn't want to give that up. So it was funny to watch them reduce themselves to absurdity rather than give up their belief in evolution, which they used to protect them from a God who's rightly angry at them for their sin. Or SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. We have all these radio telescopes pointed out into space, listening for alien signals. We haven't found any. I don't think we will. I don't think there's intelligent life out in space. I sometimes wonder if there's intelligent life on Earth. But here's the interesting thing, though. There are lots of radio signals in space. Did you know the sun gives off radio signals? It sounds like static. There are stars that give off radio signals. There are stars called pulsars that give off this pip, 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 pip radio signal as they spin. And so given that there's all these natural unintelligent radio signals in space, how would you distinguish an intelligent transmission from all these natural ones? And the answer is the intelligent transmission would have information in it. It would have instructions in it. If we got information from, if we're listening in space and we got the signal on how to build a warp drive and we built it and it worked, that'd be pretty convincing, wouldn't it? And yet those same scientists, when they look through a microscope, when they look at DNA, they say, well, that's just chance. Isn't that interesting? The whole SETI program is predicated on the fact that information can only come from mind, and yet they deny that when it comes to evolution. Let's talk about geology now. Rock layers and how those confirm biblical creation and a worldwide flood. The first little myth we have to blow up is the idea that we know the age of these rocks, right? Because they've been radiometrically dated. And there's a lot of misconceptions about that. People have an almost godlike faith in some scientists, I think, secular scientists. And they think, well, yeah, scientists, they can date rocks because radiometric dating, they take the rock and they scan it with their tricorder and it measures the agicals and it tells you how old the rock is. Well, it doesn't really work that way. I want to show you how radiometric dating is supposed to work so you can understand the process, and then we'll see why it doesn't. You really can't date a rock scientifically. You can't. There are certain atoms that are unstable. Atoms were made of atoms, right? You got protons and neutrons in the nucleus and electrons circling around. Certain atoms of the larger varieties that are higher up on the periodic table, some of them are unstable, like uranium-238. Uranium-238 is unstable, and that means that it will spontaneously change into another atom, releasing energy. And so in the case of uranium-238, it will spit out 2 protons and 2 neutrons, and that'll convert it to thorium-234. Okay, so and you don't have to do anything. It just does this by itself. It'll sit there for a while as uranium-238, and then pop, it'll eject a helium nucleus and convert to thorium. And then thorium will sit there for a while, and it's unstable too. And so pop, it'll emit a electron or positron and convert to the next element, which converts to the next one, and so on. You don't have to do anything. This just happens spontaneously, atom by atom. And you don't know when any individual atom is going to pop, but you know statistically that after a while, the uranium will eventually turn to lead. And lead is stable, so once you're lead-206, you're going to remain lead-206 forever. It's perfectly happy to be lead-206. So you can think of it like popcorn. You don't know when any individual kernel is going to pop, but you do know that after 2 minutes in your microwave, they're all pretty much going to be popped if they're going to pop, right? And so it's the same way with uranium, except the half-life is much longer. With uranium, it theoretically would take billions of years for it all to convert to lead, but some are faster, some are slower. And so the bottom line is if you had a chunk of solid uranium and you waited for billions of years, eventually it'd be part uranium, part lead. And if you waited long enough, eventually it would be all lead. Okay? Uranium changes to lead over time. And the idea is you find a rock that's got some uranium and some lead in it, and you can use that like a clock to tell you how old that rock is. And that'll give you some assessment for how old the Earth is, because the Earth would have to be older than the rock that rests upon it. So that's pretty neat, right? So you find a rock that's got some uranium, some lead. We know the rate at which uranium changes to lead. You work the problem backwards and figure out when it was all uranium. But wait a minute, how do you know the rock was all uranium to begin with? Maybe it had some lead in it to begin with. In which case your age estimate would be inflated. And by the way, secularists do not assume that the rock was all uranium to begin with. They know it had some lead in it to begin with. Well, how much lead should we start with? Well, you tell me how old you want the rock to be. I'll tell you how much lead it started with. You see the problem? You can think of the uranium changing to lead like sand going from the top chamber to the bottom chamber in an hourglass. And you can use an hourglass to tell time under certain assumptions. If I had an hourglass going when you first came in here and it looked like that, and I asked you, how long ago did I turn that over? You say, well, it's an hourglass. It's about halfway through. Half an hour. Pretty good, right? I said, I got you, because in fact, I turned it over only 1 minute ago, but already a lot of the sand was in the bottom chamber. Okay? So that's an assumption of initial conditions. How do you know the initial amount of uranium to lead? And by the way, and there are techniques that secularists use to try and get around that, but the fact is you don't ultimately know the initial ratio of the elements. You don't, because you weren't there when the rock formed. How do you know that somebody didn't add sand when you weren't looking or remove sand? Uranium's leachable in salt water. It can move in and out of the rock. Interesting. And if you don't take that into consideration, your age estimate will be wrong. How do you know the throat of the bottle's always been the same size? That's probably pretty realistic for an hourglass, right? But we don't know that the rate at which uranium changes into lead has always been constant throughout Earth history. In fact, there is very compelling evidence that it has not been constant throughout Earth history. There are certain kinds of radioactivity we can speed up in a laboratory. The reaction from, rhenium-osmium reaction has been sped up in a laboratory by a factor of 1 billion. We can make it decay 1 billion times faster. And there are probably natural ways to do that as well. So my point is, radiometric dating is based on a number of assumptions that you can't ultimately know. The idea that we know the initial conditions, the ratio of uranium to lead, the idea that the decay rate has always been constant throughout history, you don't know that, and there is some evidence against it, or that the system is closed, and so uranium has not moved into or out of the rock. If any one of those is wrong, your age estimate will be wrong. And the interesting thing is, regardless of these details, if you remember these or not, we've tested radiometric dating on recent rocks. When Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980 and subsequent eruptions, it formed brand new rocks. And radiometric dating is supposed to tell you when the rock hardened, because when it's liquid, the elements can flow in and out. But when it's hardened, that's supposed to trap them in. It sets the 0 point of the clock. Well, we took some rocks from Mount St. Helens and sent them into secular labs, so we couldn't be accused of bias, and had them radiometrically dated. And those rocks came back with age estimates of hundreds of thousands to millions of years on rocks that, in fact, are just a few years old. You say, well, that's an anomaly. That's just, well, the same thing's been done with rocks from Hawaii. You take a rock from Hawaii, a brand new rock, you can stick your pole in the magma, right, or lava, and pull it out, let it harden, send it into a lab. You'll get millions of years for a rock that you saw form. Isn't that interesting? There are different methods, there are different ways of doing this, but the fact is they do not produce consistently right results on rocks whose age is known. Radiometric dating has been shown to not work on rocks of known age, and yet secularists assume that it works on rocks of unknown age. I don't find that to be very logical. In fact, there are some methods, the isochron method, where you can actually get a negative age, which I think is interesting. You can hold in your hand a rock that, according to radiometric dating, has not formed yet. That happens. Interesting. That's the bottom line. What about carbon dating? Carbon dating is better. Now, it's not perfect either, but it's better because, at least with carbon dating, when we test it on things of known age, it tends to give close to the right answer, within a factor of a few, within a factor of 10 maybe. And the way carbon dating works, it's similar. Most carbon is C12, and C12 is stable. It'll remain C12 forever. But there's a certain variety of carbon, C14, that's produced in the upper atmosphere when cosmic rays bombard nitrogen atoms, converts them to C14. C14 is unstable. Those two extra neutrons make it unhappy, and it will want to convert to nitrogen, which it does spontaneously with a half-life of 5,700 years. So you have a chunk of solid C14. After 5,700 years, half of it will be nitrogen. It'll have decayed away. And after another 5,700 years, another half, and so on. And after 1 million years, you don't have a single atom left. And it's produced in the upper atmosphere. So it's part of our atmosphere. There's some carbon 14 in this room right now. And when you're alive, you eat food. The plants take in the C14 from the atmosphere, and they incorporate that into their structure. The animals eat the plants. We eat the plants, or we eat the animals that ate the plants. And so some of the carbon in your body right now is C14. So you're all slightly unstable. What do you think about that? And it's always decaying back into nitrogen. But when you're alive, you continue to replace it. You take in new food, and you breathe. And so you're constantly replenishing your supply of C14 when you're alive until you die, and then you don't replenish it anymore. When you die, it just decays away. So what you do is you can measure the total carbon in a specimen. You measure the C14 to C12 ratio, and it'll tell you how long ago the thing died. When you're alive, it remains constant, C14 to C12, because you're constantly replenishing it. And then when you die, it just fades away. And so, and when we carbon date organisms, we find, they're within the biblical timescale. Carbon dating is our friend. It confirms biblical creation, even on things that evolutionists believe to be millions of years old, like coal beds. You can take a chunk of coal supposed to be 100 million years old. It shouldn't have any C14 in it if it's millions of years old. But you test it, there's C14 in it. Every one we've checked has C14 in it. which tells me it's nowhere near millions of years old, because after 1 million years, you wouldn't have one atom of C14 left. If the entire Earth were made of C14, after 1 million years, not one atom would be left, apart from a recharging mechanism. We've found it in diamonds. Diamonds that secularists believe to be 1 to 2 billion years old. They can't be that old, though. They have C14 in them. C14 doesn't last that long. It doesn't even last millions of years, let alone billions. That confirms that the world's thousands of years old. There are lots of processes like that confirm, maybe they don't prove in an absolute sense, but they're consistent with what you'd expect given the biblical age of thousands of years that God created in 6 days a few thousand years ago. The rate at which salt fills the ocean. Even fresh water has a little bit of salt in it, which it picks up from the land, from the continents, and then it dumps that into the ocean. The water evaporates, but it leaves the salt. And so every year the oceans get very slightly saltier. And if that's been happening for billions of years, you got a problem, because when we work the math backwards, you figure out how much salt the ocean had in the past. Once you get over, even being generous to the critics, once you get up to 62 million years, it's zero. And you can't have less salt than zero salt, right? So that's an upper limit. And yet the secular age of the ocean is supposed to be 3 billion years. According to the scripture, 6,000 years, something like that. But the amount of salt content limits it to less than 62 million. Now, 6,000 is less than 62 million, but 3 billion is not less than 62 million, right? So that's a problem in the secular view. The rate at which mud accumulates on the ocean floor, we can measure that too. It's about 20 billion tons a year. You can maybe get rid of a little bit of it with plate tectonics, but at best 1 billion tons a year. So the other 19 billion tons simply accumulate. How long does it take to get Earth's current amount of mud on the ocean floor? At the current rate, 12 million years, maximum. And that's assuming there was no mud to begin with, and it assumes there was no worldwide flood, which would dump a lot of mud on the ocean floor quickly. And yet that's still inconsistent with the secular age of 3 billion years. But it's perfectly consistent as an upper limit if the world's thousands of years old. Human population. How long does it take to get Earth's current population from 2 people? It doesn't take millions of years. And yes, you have to include for higher mortality rates in the past and so on, but it's very consistent with the biblical time scale. And we have records where we can estimate that at least, and it's consistent with biblical creation. But the best evidence that the world's thousands of years old is we have the birth certificate of the universe. That's what the Bible is, at least Genesis, and it's repeated in Exodus 20:11. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea and all that's in them. God knows how long it took for him to make the earth, and he's recorded that information for us. And so what it comes down to is the secular scientists say the earth's billions of years old, take my word for it. God says, I created in 6 days, take my word for it. That's really the issue. And we've seen the science lines up with what the Bible teaches, but again, it's all a question of your presuppositions, how you look at that evidence. But what about the fossils then that we find in these rocks? Because I was given the impression that fossils take a long time to form, but here you have a fossil ichthyosaur. Apparently this happened pretty fast because it was killed and buried in the process of giving birth. You see the baby ichthyosaur being born there? They're born tail first because they're air breathers, they're reptiles, they're swimming reptiles. So as soon as it's born, it has to swim to the surface and get its first breath of air, which is kind of interesting. So, yeah, that must have happened relatively fast. You can even see some of the stomach contents that are not yet digested. There's a fish fossilized in the process of eating another fish. So very interesting. Apparently it doesn't take millions of years for these things to happen. It seems like they've happened catastrophically. Most things don't fossilize. You understand? People think, well, an animal dies and then it just slowly fossilizes over millions of years. Most things don't. And you know that. You've seen an animal left on the side of the road, like our dead cat Earl here. And we're just going to wait and watch him slowly fossilize over millions of years, right? Well, you wait a few days. Well, now he's a smelly dead cat on the grass. You wait a few more days, very smelly dead cat on the grass. You wait a few more days, part of him's missing. You wait a few more days, more of him's missing. You wait a few more days, all of him's missing. Yeah, that's what happens, right? You've seen that. You've seen that happen. Animals don't just become statues over millions of years. They decay. They're recycled back into the environment, and I'm very grateful for that. But even then, see, to get something to fossilize, you have to bury it to protect it from the elements. Okay, and even then I was given the wrong impression because we find fossil fish all over the world. And I was taught what happens is the fish dies, sinks down to the bottom, and then over millions of years, sediment covers it, so that one layer of sediment happens the millions of years after the next. Well, that doesn't make any sense because if that layer of sediment happened a million years after that one, the top of the fish would have had plenty of time to decay because it's exposed to the environment. You have to cover the whole thing quickly in order to get fossilization to happen. And most fish float anyway, and they're picked off by scavengers, and they don't just fossilize, right? When you've probably seen, National Geographic or Discovery Channel where they go down to the bottom of the ocean. I love those things where they go down to the bottom of the ocean. You don't see billions of dead fish fossilizing on the ocean floor. You don't see that. If you do want to form a fossil fish, here's how you do it. You go home to your aquarium and you dump some concrete in it, okay? And it's going to kill a fish, of course. It's going to bury him quickly. And because you have a cementing agent there, it's the mud is going to become rock, basically. That's what concrete is. It's artificial sedimentary rock. And usually what happens is there's enough bacteria left that they can still decay away the outer portion, the fleshy parts of the fish, but not the bone. And so the minerals will then move in and fill in the little holes in the bone. Bone is porous. It's very light. Fossils are heavy because the minerals have come in and filled in all the holes in the bone. And there's your fossil fish. And it doesn't take millions of years. Not at all. It happens quickly. What about the kinds of fossils that we find? Do we find evidence of evolution? Well, no. We find variation within a kind. We find different breeds of horses. We find different breeds of camels. We find different breeds of dogs in the past. That's what we find in the fossil record. We don't find a non-horse evolving to a horse. People say, well, here you go, the evolution of the horse. And see, the feet are a little different on those ones. And the number of ribs is a little different, and so on. By the way, if you put it in the order of feet, thinking that it evolved that way, it's different than if you put it in the order of number of ribs. Interesting. So you can't have a consistent evolutionary path there. These are just different breeds of horse. That's what they are. See, but that one on the end there, that one's real small. But there are breeds of horse today that are very small. These are both adult horses. They're just different breeds. There's lots of variation within the horse kind. Some varieties have gone extinct where their feet were different. Instead of having the single hoof and they had the three where it splits off. But there's lots of varieties of horse today. That's not evolution, that's just horses, right? Variation within a kind is what we see in the fossil record. What about the rocks in which these fossils are found? Don't rocks take millions of years to form? Here's a set of car keys embedded inside solid rock. I don't think that took millions of years to form. Here's a man-made clock embedded inside solid rock. At least we know when it happened, right? That's the one rock we know right when it formed. All these layers. Not all those are rock, but a lot of them are rock, and yet those did not exist before 1980. Those were formed in the Mount St. Helens eruptions. And here's a person down there for scale. Oh, surely those took millions of years, right? No. That sediment was deposited quickly, and some of it has, the conditions weren't ideal for forming rock, but some of them have solidified into rock at this point. And you even have a canyon there. This is all produced by that Mount St. Helens eruption. Pretty amazing. And it carved out a canyon 1/40th the scale of the Grand Canyon in a matter of hours. It doesn't take millions of years to form canyons or the rock layers around them. It can happen quickly. See, they used to say that these fine layers that you find in sedimentary rocks, those are annual. 1 year, 1 year, 1 year. You add them up, millions of years. See? Well, I'm afraid all those were produced in the Mount St. Helens eruption. So they're not annual at all. And those are the same kinds of layers you find in the Tapete Sandstone, which covers much of the United States, cuts through the Grand Canyon. Continental scale deposit. That's interesting. So whatever laid down those layers was, covering the entire continent. A worldwide flood would do that, wouldn't it? Yeah. We find trees buried vertically in sediment. They used to say, well, coal forms in swamps, right? Peat accumulates at the bottom of the tree, because you'll find coal a lot of times with trees like that. There's some coal at the bottom. But the interesting thing about these trees is that they don't have roots. And that's a little surprising, because don't most trees have roots? I mean, that's kind of interesting. But we now know how this happens, and it has nothing to do with millions of years. It has to do with catastrophe. When Mount St. Helens erupted, it produced this kind of phenomenon. What it did is it uprooted trees because of the explosion, and that's why they don't have roots. They have little remnants of roots, but they don't have full root system. And there's a lake next to Mount St. Helens, Spirit Lake, and most of the logs would float vertically. A few of them would be horizontal. Most of them would be vertical. And as they become waterlogged, they would sink down to the bottom, and then they're covered with sediment left over from that explosion. And so that's how this happens. It has nothing to do with millions of years. It has to do with catastrophe. It's flood conditions that do that. So again, when we take a look at the rock layers and how they form, we find that good observational science, at least the kind we can test today, it confirms biblical creation and a worldwide flood. It's consistent with it. It's consistent with what we'd expect. And so when you see these rock layers, you shouldn't be thinking millions of years. You should be thinking, wait a minute, worldwide flood. God judges sin. That's the real meaning of the rocks. The real meaning is repent. That's what they mean, right? And it's interesting because the Bible predicted that people would come and deny the worldwide flood. It says that for this they willfully forget. They're deliberately ignorant, that by the word of God the heavens were of old and the earth standing out of water and in the water by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. It says they're willingly ignorant of that worldwide flood. And that's exactly what we're seeing today. It's exactly what we're seeing. But if you understand this, if you understand science confirms biblical creation, then if you're not a believer, you got a problem. Because you realize, wait a minute, it's because of what Adam did that the world has been plunged into darkness. I've got a problem because I've sinned just like Adam has. God can't let me into that new creation, that very good creation, because I'd ruin it the same way Adam ruined the original. That's a problem for us because we've all sinned. But of course, God made a way of escape. Jesus Christ took our payment on the cross. And if we trust in him, if we repent, trust in him, he's offered to pay that penalty for our sins. He's already done it. And so we just need to receive that. God is a righteous God, and therefore he will judge sin. That's the whole point of the flood, really. The wickedness of mankind became great to the point that God wouldn't tolerate it anymore. But God's also merciful, and he provided a way of escape. And in Noah's day, that was the ark. That really is kind of a picture of Christ, isn't it? Because the ark gave Noah physical salvation from a physical disaster, whereas Jesus gives us spiritual salvation from the both spiritual and physical disaster to come. And so I think it's interesting, too. The Bible says Noah was a preacher of righteousness. So he was out there preaching, come on board the ark and be saved. And yet, of all the people in the world, and there could have been billions of people in the world at that point, by the way, if you do the math. Could have been as many as today. And yet 8 were saved. 8 responded to God's message of repentance and mercy. And they were Noah's immediate family, interestingly. And then God closed the door on that ark. I think that's significant, too. God's the one that decides time of grace is over, time of judgment begins. And we don't know when that is for each one of us, which is why today is the day of salvation. So I never like to end without reminding people about the gospel message that Christ does offer salvation for forgiveness of sins if we just trust in him. We do have this presentation available on DVD, Creation Science Confirms the Bible. And then the one from last night, we have that not only on DVD but on book format as well, which I think, I'm a reader, so if you like that. But we do have the DVD of that as well. We may or may not have this in stock. Understanding Genesis, which we'll cover tomorrow morning in the main service. How do we understand Genesis? Does it really mean 6 days? Well, we'll talk about that. Taking Back Astronomy, which we'll cover Sunday evening, and how all that works. Discerning Truth, how to spot logical fallacies and arguments that evolutionists make. Evolution and Logical Fallacies, the DVD that goes along with that. Again, we have books on my specialty field of astronomy, Stargazer's Guide to the Night Sky, how to better enjoy the night sky from a Christian perspective, if you want to know what the constellations are and which one's Saturn anyway. And if you want to get a telescope, what kind you might want to get, how to use it, and so on. Created Cosmos DVD takes you on a tour through the universe from a biblical perspective. That's just a fun program. It's the planetarium show I wrote for the Creation Museum. And his star, what about the star that guided the Magi to Christ? You ever wonder what that is? Well, I got a DVD on it. And yes, I've seen the other one, and it's not accurate. So I produced this one. Hopefully this one will do a little better. Creation Evangelism, how to use creation to share the gospel more effectively. There's a good way to do it, and that DVD explores that issue. Keeping Faith in an Age of Reason answers 420 alleged Bible contradictions. Not one of them is legitimate. Physics of Einstein. What about black holes? And what about distant starlight? How did God get the light from the galaxies to Earth in the biblical time scale? We'll hit that Sunday evening, but the book goes into more details on that. I included math sections for those who are adventurous, but I put them in boxes so you can skip the math if you want to. And it's written for laymen, so you can all read it, hopefully. You can get all the DVDs together for a discount. You can get all the books together for a discount, or you can get everything together for a discount. And I forgot to include a slide for it, but we also have a new logic curriculum that I think is really neat. It shows you how logic is rooted in the Christian worldview, and it takes you through common logical fallacies, mistakes that evolutionists often make, and so on. And we do have, of course, our free monthly newsletter. Don't forget to sign up for that. It is free, and it is email, so make sure you put your email address and do so legibly, or you'll get nothing. Check us out as well on the Biblical Science Institute website. And thank you very much. We'll come back at, I think it's 11, right? So thank you.